Welcome to Still Unanswered. I'm Elena Maris. Tonight, New Orleans, 1918 and 1919, a city that wakes up to a sound no one wants to hear and then listens for music, as if music could keep a demon away. We're talking about the Axeman of New Orleans, and specifically the letter that changed how the city remembered the murders. This is not just a story about a brutal, unsolved string of attacks. It's about who got to speak, who got believed, and how a single published letter turned terror into a kind of cultural performance.
Elena, thanks for having me. I'm Marcus Ellery. I study early 20th century New Orleans, immigration, politics, the emergence of jazz, and the Axeman sits at this strange intersection of all those things. It's a case where the crimes happened in working-class apartments above groceries, and the mythology got broadcast in the city's best newspaper. So the letter is not a footnote. It's the moment the whole thing changes shape.
Right. So let's set the scene. New Orleans in 1918. Marcus, paint that picture for us. What was the city like when those first attacks began?
It was a port city, bustling, layered, French-speaking Creole neighborhoods, long-established black communities living under Jim Crow, and an increasingly visible population of Italian and Sicilian immigrants running small groceries and other trades. There was existing anti-Italian sentiment rooted in events like the 1891 lynching after the Hennessy murder, 11 or so Italian prisoners murdered by a mob after an acquittal. That history left Sicilian immigrants especially vulnerable. They were economically visible, small store owners, but socially exposed in a city with deep racial and ethnic hierarchies.
You can hear the pressure in that. Economic visibility paired with social precariousness. And then the first big attack, the Maggios, happens in May 1918. Tell us what we know.
On the night of May 22-23, 1918, Joseph and Catherine Maggio were attacked in the apartment above their grocery on Upper Line and Magnolia. Their throats were cut with a straight razor, and their skulls struck with an axe. Catherine's throat was cut almost to the point of severing her head. Joseph was found alive by his brothers but died minutes later. Investigators reported a panel from the back door had been removed with a chisel, the panel and chisel left nearby, an entry method that would become a recurring detail in later scenes.
And there's that eerie, procedural detail. Changing clothes, a razor traced back to Andrew Maggio, the barber. It's intimate. The killer using the family's own axe, or taking a chisel to a door panel. It's like the crimes were staged to leave a signature, but also to blend with domestic tools, right?
Exactly. In the Maggio case, bloody clothes were found in the apartment, suggesting the attacker may have changed before leaving, and a straight razor used on the throats was later traced to Andrew Maggio, Joseph's brother, who had taken it home to sharpen. Andrew gave a story. He'd been at a Navy send-off the night before and was drunk. He said he heard groaning, but according to police, he didn't wake during the attack. He became a prime suspect briefly, which also tells you something. Law enforcement often looked first at people inside the household, relatives, employees, rather than at a stranger slipping through a back panel.
So, right away, the investigation leans towards suspicion of family or local actors, which is a pattern we'll keep seeing. Now, the Maggio killing was just the beginning. Over the next year, more attacks, sometimes fatal, sometimes not, hit similar homes. Give us that sweep, Marcus.
There were a string of attacks through 1918 into 1919. In late June 1918, Louis Bessumer and Harriet Lowe were found badly wounded. The axe belonged to Bessumer. Lowe later accused Bessumer on her deathbed. He was tried and acquitted. In August, Anna Schneider, 8 months pregnant, was beaten and found with head injuries. She survived and gave birth 2 days later. Also in August, Joseph Romano, an Italian grocer, was attacked and later died. His nieces reported seeing a large, dark-clothed man flee wearing a slouched hat. In March 1919, Charles and Rosie Cortamilia in Gretna were attacked. Their 2-year-old daughter Mary died in her mother's arms. Later in 1919, there were more incidents. Sarah Lowen was attacked and survived, and Michael Pepitone was killed in October of that year. These incidents shared eerie similarities: night attacks, household axes or chisels used, throats cut in some cases, and little evidence of robbery.
It's a brutal series when you say it that way. Families sleeping above their businesses, waking to this violence. And then, right in the heart of that panic, the letter appears. March 13th, 1919, dated from hell or something like that. Help me with the letter, Marcus. Read us into it.
The letter is theatrical. It was dated March 13th, 1919, and printed in the Times-Picayune on March 16th. It opens in a voice that claims to be otherworldly. They have never caught me, and they never will. They have never seen me, for I am invisible, like the ether that surrounds your earth. The writer says he is not human, but a spirit and a demon from the hottest hell. Then he taunts the police and announces he will visit the city on the next Tuesday night at 12:15 a.m. Crucially, this line, "I am very fond of jazz music. I swear by all the devils in the nether regions that every person shall be spared in whose home a jazz band is in full swing." It ends with, "Signed, the Axeman." The tone is almost performative, witty, literate, and deliberately theatrical.
It's astonishing. You get this image of a city either laughing to keep from crying or actually throwing a party because a killer asked them to play music. What happened on that night? The so-called jazz night.
Reports say the city responded. Dance halls and bars hired jazz bands. Private homes turned on phonographs or had friends play. There were rooms full of people jazzing through the midnight hours. Some people fled town or hid with relatives. And that night, no attack. Whether that was because the author of the letter was really the killer and decided to keep his word, or because the letter was a hoax and the real killer ignored it, is the big question.
The image is so cinematic. New Orleans, a sea of music at midnight. Families clinging to a saxophone like a talisman. Marcus, do we know if the letter actually came from the killer?
We can't say for sure. Historians debate it. Some modern researchers, including Miriam Davis, have suggested the letter might have been written by someone else, possibly a musician, who wanted to create a spectacle or even promote jazz. Joseph Davila, a local musician and composer, has been proposed as a candidate for authorship. That theory points to the letter's theatrical style and its unusual, affectionate praise of jazz. It's plausible the letter was a hoax, whether a publicity stunt or a twisted prank that then took on a life of its own.
So the letter might not have been the killer's voice at all. That complicates everything. If the letter was a hoax, then the Axeman identity we clutch onto might be partly the city's construction, rather than the criminals.
Exactly. And that construction matters, because once your mythology is in print, especially in a major paper like the Times-Picayune, it reshapes how police, neighbors, and victims interpret further events. It becomes a filter for fear.
Let's talk theories. People have offered several ideas about who or what the Axeman was. Walk me through the main contenders.
There are a few recurring lines. One is the lone serial killer idea, someone with a psychological compulsion, perhaps sexually sadistic, targeting couples, attacking women, and killing or maiming men who interfere. Authors Colin and Damon Wilson argued along these lines. Then there's the theory centered on anti-Italian or ethnic hatred. The victims were often Italian or Sicilian grocers, and the 1891 lynching created a long shadow of suspicion and violence against Italians. Another is the Black Hand or organized crime theory, the idea that extortion or Black Hand disputes could have led to violent enforcement. A related idea is that some attacks were the result of commercial rivalry, grocers attacking competitors and borrowing the Axeman's MO to confuse investigators. And finally, the Mumfre thread. Frank or Joseph Doc Mumfre, comes up in later folklore, tied to the story of a widow who supposedly tracked and killed a man in Los Angeles she believed responsible for her husband's death.
Let's pause on that Mumfre story. It's the sort of narrative that's irresistible. A widow and revenge in LA. But it's messy, right?
It's very messy. The commonly told version is that Mike Pepitone was killed in October 1919, and his widow later shot a man, variously named Joseph or Frank Doc Mumfre, in Los Angeles in December 1921, claiming he had killed her husband. Some researchers found records for a Frank Doc Mumfre with a criminal history and extortion links, but there was never a definitive legal link tying him to the Axeman crimes, no confession that sits in the official record, and some of the details in popular retellings don't line up cleanly with primary documents. So it's compelling folklore, maybe even plausible, but not a solved case.
It's such a good story that people want to close the case with it, but the records are stubbornly quiet. Another thread is the Black Hand, or organized crime angle. How does that square with the letter or with the pattern?
The Black Hand was a shorthand, often applied unfairly, to describe extortion and anonymous threats in immigrant communities. Law enforcement at the time liked to blame Italian criminal syndicates when violence touched Italian neighborhoods. Some have speculated the attacks could be related to extortion or enforcement, but there's no solid evidence of business extortion letters or demands tied to most victims. The jazz letter doesn't demand money, it theatricalizes violence instead. So while it's tempting to shoehorn the Axeman into the Black Hand narrative, which would make the crimes fit a known social pathology, the specific material evidence for extortion isn't there in most cases.
And then there's the idea that some of these attacks were simply domestic, neighbors, rivals, while others were the work of a roaming killer, and we smush them together into a single legend. Is that what scholars mean when they say the Axeman might be more than one man?
Yes, we have to allow for the possibility that some crimes, murders, attacks, suspicious beats on the head, were one-off domestic incidents or commercial disputes. At the same time, several attacks share distinctive elements: chiseled door panels, axes from the victim's property, throat cuts, nighttime entry. Those recurring details suggest at least some common perpetrator, even if copycats and opportunists blurred the pattern. The Axeman as a single continuous serial figure makes for tidy narrative, but the archival record resists tidy reduction. It's also important to remember the uneven way police handled cases. They often preferred domestic or personal explanations, which could obscure a larger pattern.
Let's return to the letter night, the jazz night. There's a potent irony there. Jazz was created and played predominantly by Black musicians, yet many of the victims were Italian immigrants. And the city reacted to this letter by amplifying jazz as a protective ritual. What does that juxtaposition tell us?
It exposes layered tensions. Jazz, by 1919, had been cultivated in places like Storyville, which the federal government closed in 1917. Black musicians were central to that sound, but by the time of the Axeman letter, the music had been racialized, commercialized, and sometimes constrained. The letter, if genuine, seems to delight in jazz in a way that aligns with theatricality rather than cultural respect. If the letter were a hoax produced by a musician, it would complicate matters further. Someone might have been trying to use jazz's cultural force as a lever in a panic. Either way, the public ritual of jazzing it out shifted attention from the victims and the crimes to a citywide performance, which has the effect of making the event into folklore rather than a forensic investigation.
It's almost as if the music became both shield and mask. It shielded people that night, maybe, but it also helped mask the messy realities of who was targeted and why.
Yes. And over time, the story we tell tends to keep the most colorful elements, the mysterious letter, the jazz night, while the gritty day-to-day details of the families, the court cases, the incorrect accusations and recantations fade. That is why we must push to recenter the victims.
So let's do that now. Marcus, name some of the people who are often reduced to statistics in the retellings. Remind us who they were beyond a headline.
Joseph and Catherine Maggio, small business people living above their grocery on Upper Line in Magnolia. Joseph's brothers, Andrew and Jake, not only found the bodies but lived with suspicion afterward. Charles and Rosie Cortimiglia and their 2-year-old daughter Mary, living in Gretna above their business. Mary died in her mother's arms, and Rosie later recanted an accusation she made under pressure, which sent other men to prison briefly before they were freed. Anna Schneider survived serious head wounds while pregnant and gave birth 2 days later. Joseph Romano's nieces saw someone flee. Those images linger in testimony but quickly give way to sensational headlines. Louis Bessemer and Harriet Lowe. Lowe's bedside accusation of Bessemer and his subsequent trial and acquittal reveal how messy and traumatized the legal response was. These were working families, not caricatures.
Their names matter. Saying them back slows us down. The more you dig into the case, the more you see how newspapers at the time both amplified the terror and often exoticized the victims, calling them Sicilians or Italians in a way that flattened their humanity, right?
Right. The press plays a dual role. It creates the figure of the Axeman, and it also recycles stereotypes about Italians, the Black Hand, organized crime narratives, that sometimes deflect attention from deeper investigative work. So the victims' lives, what they worked for, their families, are often reduced to background for a myth the city loves to tell.
Let's talk about investigative limitations. We can't go looking for DNA in 1919. But what else hamstrung the pursuit of the Axeman?
The era's forensic tools were limited. Fingerprinting existed but wasn't used as extensively or systematically as it would be later. Physical evidence was often ordinary domestic objects, an axe from a backyard, a chisel, a razor, that pointed back to the household more often than to an outside suspect. Police procedures varied between jurisdictions, think New Orleans proper versus Gretna, and record-keeping was patchy. Many documents are lost or incomplete. Investigators also tended to opt for domestic or personal explanations, which could stifle a more coordinated serial suspect investigation. All of that, combined with the social vulnerability of many victims, produced a thin trail.
And maybe importantly, the people most affected didn't have the same social capital to force the city to keep digging.
Exactly. Investigative energy often followed public clamor and political pressure. A mass lynching in 1891 shook the city's institutions in a way that an ongoing series of attacks on immigrant grocers didn't. The victims here were just not prioritized in the same way.
Marcus, some historians try to hitch the Axeman to larger narratives of New Orleans, like the closure of Storyville in 1917, and later unsolved cases like the so-called Storyville Slayer. Is that useful context or just tempting pattern-making?
It's useful if we use it carefully. Storyville's closure did change the city's musical and social geography. Musicians were displaced, and the jazz economy shifted. That context helps explain why jazz and musicians figured so prominently in the public imagination by 1919. Similarly, later cases like the Storyville Slayer show a pattern in which violence against marginalized people produces haunting stories and unresolved grief. But we must guard against teleology, assuming the Axeman is a direct ancestor of every other New Orleans crime story. Instead, treat the context as layers that help us understand why the letter and the myth resonated so powerfully.
Let's take a quick detour to the question of the letter's authorship. Miriam Davis and others have floated the musician Joseph Davila as a possible writer. What makes that plausible?
The letter's style is literate and theatrical, and it expresses an oddly specific, affectionate relationship to jazz. Joseph Davila was a local musician and composer. Someone in the music world could plausibly write a theatrical, promotional-sounding letter. Moreover, the timing after Storyville's closure and general attacks on the music scene makes publicity or cultural provocation a tempting motive. But that said, the evidence connecting Davila to the letter is circumstantial. It's a persuasive hypothesis, not proof.
So the letter could be a publicity stunt, or a prank, or it could have been the killer's own perverse flourish. We simply can't say. Marcus, one of my favorite lines from the material you sent me is that the Axeman named himself with the letter. Tell us about how a singular public text can become an identity.
The moment someone signs a letter, the Axeman, and it runs in the Times-Picayune, a private offender becomes a public brand. The letter supplies voice, motive, and theatricality, everything the paper needs to sell copy, and everything the public needs to make sense of fear. Once that voice exists in print, every subsequent attack can be narrated as an installment in the Axeman story, even when facts are messy or contradictory. In other words, the letter didn't just warn the city, it created the persona that the city then chased.
You've done a lot of work with archival police files. Do the records ever suggest someone like Mumfre was actually responsible, or is it more silence and rumors?
What I see in the archives is suggestion and rumor more than clean lines of proof. Frank Doc Mumfre appears in criminal records, and he had a reputation that fits the sort of figure people would suspect: extortion, underworld dealings. The later Los Angeles shooting by a woman claiming to avenge her husband adds dramatic closure and folklore. But in the primary records linking him definitively to the Axeman murders, there's nothing unambiguous. So he is a plausible suspect in the mosaic of narratives, but not a solved answer.
We keep circling back to the same place: compelling stories, ambiguous evidence. Before we close, Marcus, I want to ask you a moral question. If you had to advise a podcast like this one on how to tell the story of the Axeman responsibly, what would you say?
Center the victims' names, always. Put the spectacular elements, the letter, the jazz night, in context and make clear what's documented and what's speculation. Resist the urge to glamorize the killer's persona. Take seriously the social context, anti-immigrant sentiment, Jim Crow dynamics, the precariousness of small grocers' lives. And when you discuss suspects, Mumfre, the Black Hand theory, Davila, be transparent about the strength of evidence. The ethical frame here is crucial. Sensational detail draws listeners, but human lives deserve accuracy and empathy.
That's an imperative I hold tightly. We have to resist letting the killer's voice drown out the names of the dead. Marcus, thank you. This is dense, and yet you make the archival puzzles feel alive.
Thank you, Alina. And to listeners, when you walk the city and hear the music, remember there are stories below the music. People who kept grocers open at dawn and locked their doors at night with a different kind of fear.
Let's close by circling back to the letter, because it's the fulcrum of this case. The exact phrasing is theatrical. I am very fond of jazz music. Every person shall be spared in whose home a jazz band is in full swing. Whoever wrote that knew how to conjure a scene. Marcus, what does that conjuring accomplish for the city that night, and for us now?
It gives people an actionable ritual. Play music and you might be spared. It also transforms terror into spectacle. The city turns fear into performance. For listeners a century later, it produces a vivid image we can almost see. Windows open, phonographs grinding, dance halls packed, families playing ragtime like a charm. But the conjuring also risks substituting a mythic image for the messy reality. A dozen injured people, dead children, trials, recantations, lives upended.
The letter's theatricality is what makes the story memorable, and that's precisely why we must be vigilant about where our attention goes.
And the last point, that vigilance, feels like an instruction for all of us who retell these stories. So we'll say the names again. Joseph and Catherine Maggio, Joseph Romano, Louis Bessumer and Harriet Lowe, Anna Schneider, Charles and Rosie Cortimiglia and their daughter Mary, Sarah Lauerman, Mike Pepitone. These aren't set dressing. They're people.
Say them slowly. Say them often.
Joseph Maggio, Catherine Maggio, Joseph Romano, Louis Bessumer, Harriet Lowe, Anna Schneider, Charles Cortimiglia, Rosie Cortimiglia, Mary Cortimiglia, Sarah Lauman, Mike Pepitone. Each of these names is a life interrupted.
And each name calls us back to the limits of our knowledge and to the responsibility we have when we breathe life back into these stories.
Tonight on Still Unanswered, we've looked at how a published letter, whether authored by the killer or a provocateur, shifted panic into performance and fitted a whole city into a new narrative. We talked about social context, anti-Italian sentiment, the closure of Storyville, the precariousness of immigrant grocers, and about the ways the press and police sometimes preferred tidy explanations over messy truth. Marcus, any final thought to leave our listeners with?
Listen for the silences. In this case, the most telling absences are not the lack of a signed confession, but the lost partial records of victims' lives, the thinness of some police files, the rumors that became facts in retelling. When a crime becomes a myth, those silences harden. If you care about justice, remember to look where the light is faint.
Good note to end on. Thank you, Marcus. Dr. Marcus Ellery. Thanks for joining me and for walking through these archives with such care. To our listeners, go slow with these stories. If you're in New Orleans someday, listen to the music, but also remember what the music was once asked to do. This has been Still Unanswered. If you liked the episode, share it. But also, hold the victims' names. We'll be back with another unresolved case next week. Until then, play softly.
Thanks, Elena. Good night.